our Facebook watchers as well.
And I'm really not too far from Karen. I'm at home in Mount Baker, so just a couple miles south.
And I am all the way up in Stanwood.
Yeah, Washingtonian, native Washingtonian?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I avoid the word native when it comes to Washington, but
All
born
right.
and raised, certainly.
Born and raised.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, we're just going to give it just another minute. I think I'm frozen too. Here we are. Okay. Shrink that. I'm going to just give it just another minute, and then I'm going to go into my introduction. So if you're just joining us, thanks very much. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Feel free to send us a message in the chat. Say hello, let us know where you're Zooming from. And thanks for joining us. Well, I think I'll start. This is Karen Mayeda-Allman, and I'm one of the longtime event coordinators at the Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle, Washington. And it's my pleasure to host two writers who are both here Zooming in from Washington today. So we're Zooming today from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We encourage you to find out more about and support the programs of the Lushootseed Language and Cultural Center. And I have a little information about the center here in the text that I just posted in the chat. And there's also the titles of our two authors' books and links to Elliott Bay, where we have both books in stock. So today we're presenting two scholar activists in conversation with each other about their work on viruses, activism, and social justice. One is a scientist, the other an archivist, and both are influenced by queer theory. Marika Cifor is an assistant professor in the Information School at University of Washington and an adjunct faculty member in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. A multidisciplinary feminist scholar whose work in archival and digital studies centers marginalized communities. She received a PhD from the Department of Information Studies at University of California, Los Angeles. She's here to speak about her book, Viral Cultures, and here it is. Beautiful. Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS. And this was published earlier this year by the University of Minnesota Press. Viral Cultures explores the role of artists, archivists, and activists in documenting the ongoing HIV/AIDS crisis, which is now in its 40th year. Viral Cultures was recently named in The Atlantic as one of 9 books by which to better understand viruses, illnesses, and health. And that article was written by Joseph Osmundson, and here's his book, and he is our other panelist today. So Joseph is a scientist, podcaster, and writer based in New York City, though he is from Washington. He has a PhD from the Rockefeller University, and the PhD is in molecular biophysics. And he's also, I think, a clinical assistant professor of biology at NYU. He publishes both in professional journals such as Cell and also in literary journals such as the Kenyon Review, the Lambda Literary Review, and also, as I said, the Atlantic. He's the author of Capsid, a love song, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and also won the Pause Award for Best HIV Writing. And he's also the author of Inside Out, published by Sibling Rivalry Press. Today, he's speaking about his book, Virology, Essays for the Living, the Dead, and the Small Things in Between. And this was published just a few days ago by Norton. Virology received a rave review in the New York Times this week, and he draws upon, among other things, what our communities have learned from the HIV/AIDS crisis, and also what we've learned and also what he's experienced in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it was interesting to hear from Joseph that when he was shopping this book, that he was told by some publishers that, COVID's going to be over, so maybe this book isn't so timely. Well, I think we're finding out that there's a lot to learn from those early days, and it certainly is still with us. So each of our panelists today will read a bit and speak about their books. They'll have some conversation with each other, and we invite your questions, and please put them in the chat, and we'll bring those in a little later in the program. So thank you so much, Joseph and Marika. And Marika, I think, is going to start. So welcome to our visual stage. Oh, Joseph's starting. Sorry about that. Joseph, welcome Joseph to our virtual stage.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Marika, for being here. I really am so excited to talk to an archivist about how our projects connect. This is I think my first and only virtual event. So I want to, on the record, thank again the Norton team who've been incredible, especially my editor, Mo, who, when I turned in actually the first draft of the archives essay, said, it's okay, but you're holding back. I was afraid to send sort of my publisher something so experimental. And Mo said, no, you need to go further. And I did. And I appreciate that from Mo. Thank you all for coming. I think we're all in a little bit of a dark place, a tough place with how viruses are still impacting us in our daily lives. If it's not COVID, then it's stigma and racism around monkeypox and how it's spreading. It seems like viruses don't want to leave us alone. And so I hope both of our books and our guide, both of our books and our time tonight can be a guide and a call to community care. So I'm going to read for 10 minutes, 2 sections from the archives essay, the very beginning and the very end, and I hope you see how they're connected. And remember, mine is not a scholarly book, so I do use the word fuck, so just a warning. This is a memory from February 14th, 2013. It was Valentine's Day, so at least we would fuck. Whether I had a partner or not, I always hated the day for its red roses, for its consumerism, for the fact that everyone seemed to notice that I had a passing resemblance to Cupid, all rosy cheeks. That year, I did have a sort of boyfriend, and I called him my Sherry. Khalid wasn't much for Valentine's Day either. He was more about public sex than public displays of a romantic affection, and he hated pink. He could be soft and kind and romantic, yes, but only in the house. He loved my cooking, and so I'd cook something special, steak, a spinach salad, even though I preferred arugula. And what to do with a night we'd be locked inside, hiding from the romantic world. We'd been meaning to watch the movie for 2 months already, and I'd had a DVD, remember those, for at least a month. I was teaching that semester at Vassar, biochemistry. To drive home how the material we were studying was applicable to saved lives and public health, I wanted to show a film about drug discovery. The year before, the film How to Survive a Plague came out using archival footage of ACT UP in New York, focusing on its role in developing the drugs that changed HIV treatment in 1996, saving so many lives. My Sherry borrowed his roommate's PlayStation and connected it to the TV in his room on his low bedroom dresser. We brought plates of food into his room. We laid on the floor with our food in front of us. I leaned up to kiss him. Can I start? Of course, I said, eat while it's hot. I do his voice as a douchebag because he was kind of a douchebag. I meant the movie, he said. You'll hear that in the audiobook too. Oh, so I bit into a forkful of steak I couldn't afford. What to even say? What happens next? Larry Kramer shouted about a plague. A bunch of fags didn't want to take it anymore. A bunch of queens fought as hard as anyone had ever fought. They fought to live. The film tackles the science advocacy of the ACT UP Treatment and Data Working Group and the Treatment Action Group that grew out of it in 1991. The main characters, Peter Staley, Mark Harrington, Bob Rafsky, David Barr, they worked alongside and learned from chemist Iris Long to become world experts in the virus that was even then killing so many in their community. They refused to die quietly, protesting and shouting, insisting that silence equals death. ACT UP, I knew, was multiracial and multifocal, from homelessness to gentrification to sexism and HIV treatment, in addition to drug access and science. How to Survive a Plague is only one ACT UP story, one with mostly cute cis white men who prior to the plague years had mostly studied at good colleges and worked on Wall Street. Even that night, this much was apparent. And yet the film told as a queer scientist, as a gay man who grew up in the early plague years, it hit the story and it hit hard. It knocked the wind from my chest. From the ashes action, when those who had lost loved ones to AIDS brought their ashes to the White House and dumped them over the fence, to the end of the film, I cried. One man threw ashes over the fence, shouting twice, "I love you, Mike." He and two other men hugged and cried then, holding one another, even as the cops moved in on horses wearing gloves. I knew then who I wanted to be like, who I wanted to be. ACT UP and TAG push scientists to work harder, faster, and ultimately researchers did. They developed protease inhibitors in combinations with older drugs that blocked other viral enzymes. The protease inhibitors brought people back from death's door. People in 1996 who had access to these drugs started living. I sobbed for the living and for the dead. The next week, before assigning the film to my students, I told them that my boyfriend and I had watched it on Valentine's Day. Not exactly the most romantic. They laughed. I'd actually never come out to them officially, not that I had to, but I wanted to then because the film had made me a little braver. This story could have so easily been lost. Credit is due to the scientists, but not only to them. They were pushed, prodded, and helped along the way by activists. And how do we know? Because at ACT UP meetings and demonstrations, protesters brought cameras. Because ACT UP included artists who made signs and posters and flyers, and activists who saved them, so that I, even decades later, on a DVD, could see. The movie ended. Shit, Kalik said. I didn't know so many of those things, I told him later. Me either. I didn't know those people either, he said, Peter and whatever and all that. Can you believe it? Later that night, I reached for him in bed, but he said he couldn't, babe, not after seeing that movie. But it's Valentine's, I said, my voice soft but surprised, a little break in the phrase. After all that, you still want to fuck, he said. Of course. I'm sorry, I just can't, he said. I don't know, that was just a lot. It was, and I almost understood. I turned over and threw my arm around him. Accepting my arm, he breathed heavily and slept, my own sleep not far behind. This is from the end of the essay, June 2021. They always say, don't meet your heroes. I have met some of mine, and they aren't my heroes anymore. Alex Chi through writing, Mark Harrington and David Barr and Peter Staley through COVID activism. They aren't my heroes. Heroes don't make you laugh. You don't worry for their health. You don't ask yourself whether they're happy. You don't see the inside of a hero's life. They can't be. They aren't fully human. You don't disagree with them about a Facebook post or a tweet, but keep on loving them just the same. I sent this essay out to all my co-activists to read. This wasn't my work alone, it was ours, and I couldn't publish it without their consent. After reading all this, David Barr wrote me back, and these are his words. I wrote a piece a bunch of years ago dissecting the whole construct of PWA, which is a person living with AIDS, as a hero. We created the hero construct as a way to change the ways in which people with AIDS were presented at the time. We were either victims or vectors. The PWA was the organizing principle around which everything revolved. We were heroes, but we died. There was no time for grief. The work could continue in the name of the fallen hero. The idea of PWA empowerment gave everyone strength, regardless of serostatus. But, of course, it was a myth. We weren't heroes, and we were scared to death. The construct was useful to survival, but had long-term harmful effects. We weren't allowed weakness or grief or fear. Anger was the only emotion besides joy that was permitted and act up, and it fucked many of us up very badly later, myself included. I'm sorry, David. You were a hero to me once, and I needed you to be one. I needed to see queer people like me as strong and fearless and resilient and angry. But that made you less than human. You weren't fearless, and I'm sorry. Heroes aren't people. And if all your stories of change being made relies on heroes, you don't imagine you can make change for yourself. And we can, and we must. The people who fought against inaction in the early HIV/AIDS plague years, including Alex and David and Peter and Mark and Garance and Wafa and Judy, are just people. They're fucked up and messy and everything else we all are. I'm grateful for these people I gotten to know. Many of them I've only ever seen on Zoom. A friend of mine who knew Wafa before told me just this week that her signature look is cowboy boots. She always wears cowboy boots. I've spent countless hours with her, but I've never seen anything but what you see on Zoom. I only know her from the shoulders up. This woman I feel I know so well, who I've still never seen. I don't know what to make all of that. I feel so close to all of them. All of them I something like love. We have so little control, and I take a small solace in this. When life seems impossible, when you wake up and stub your toe and you're hungover, even though you only had 2 beers the night before because you're almost 40 and your body does that now for some reason, and you have a day full of meetings that don't matter, and your best friend is mad at you for something that deserves it. Remember that the only thing that matters is that we act when we can, how we can, the best and most we can, and that's it. I'm so grateful that I could do something, anything at all. Activism is spiritual work, archival work too, and friendship maybe most of all. From community, from friendship, the best activism and the best archives come. Because as corny as it sounds, trying when it's easy not to try is a simple way to love. The love of trying and failing, but trying again. Trying because the only thing more horrible than trying is not trying at all. That love and how we tried to live it, more than anything, is what I want the record to show. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for that, Joe, and for the introduction, Karen. I'm so thrilled to be here and to put our books in conversation. And though mine is primarily an academic text, I thought it was only fair that I also begin with a bit of the personal as well. And I'm going to jump around between the introduction and the second chapter of the book. In my AIDS activism origin story, we're in early 1990s San Francisco on the precipice of a dot-com boom. My grandmother has ventured out from her Midwestern suburb to visit us, my father, mother, and preschooler me. We're walking through Union Square. Looking down, my grandma pauses, shocked, then asks what happened. On the ground around us are chalk outlines of bodies piled upon bodies. It looks as if we've stumbled upon a crime scene. We stand there in what appears to be the aftermath of a massacre carried out amid high-end department stores, posh hotels, and the Holiday Ice Rink. My mother explains that no, there had not been a crime, at least not in the conventional sense. This was the remains of an AIDS coalition to unleash power die-in. An iconic choreography of protest, as Susan Foster has powerfully described it, performed by activists who mimic with their bodies corpses, mirroring through their embodied acts the mass death and devastation of the AIDS epidemic. Activists draw attention to the willful malfeasance perpetuated by the state, the media, and the public. The chalk outlines of bodies on the sidewalk likely quickly faded under the continuous assault of passing feet, but the memory of this AIDS encounter has stuck with me. And I want to jump forward here and talk a bit more generally about some of the kind of AIDS archives that sit at the center of this book. And the second chapter focuses primarily on ACT UP New York and its archive, and how that archive came to live at the New York Public Library. In addition to temporal limitations that foreclose agency, dominant AIDS discourse is also characterized by the imaginative restraints in terms of affected communities. Early AIDS years were largely and problematically identified with white, gay, economically privileged men, the epidemic's first recognized victims. Focusing on this period, contemporary revisitations continuously frame white, gay, middle-class men as representative of all AIDS activists and AIDS activism. Revisitation projects that reflect in part the dynamics of power within activist groups like ACT UP New York, masculinity, whiteness, class, citizenship, that shaped who did the documenting and who and what was documented, and in turn collected and preserved by AIDS archives. Privileges did not and could not save many men from the ravages of AIDS. However, these archives did and do protect them from having their memories fade altogether. Yet the ways that representations have sidelined activism by men of color, cis and trans women, incarcerated persons, intravenous drug users, and immigrants exceeds the archive's material constraints. It is not simply that the records of multiply marginalized subjects do not exist. It is that users enter the archives with a preconceived narrative about who AIDS affected. Through dominant racist and sexist practices of selective remembering, archives are situated as the site of the end of AIDS, ultimately perpetuating a narrow periodization and vision of HIV/AIDS as past in ways that defang contemporary responses to what is, of course, an ongoing epidemic, and as Karen gestured to, one that we're at least in the 40th year of. And I want to talk to, in ways, just very briefly about how ACT UP did their documentation, which is a major focus of this second chapter. And that of documentation too is shaped by the kind of temporal rhythms of the epidemic, which before 1996, as Joseph talked about, right, before there are better and more effective treatments for people living with HIV. AIDS, of course, was HIV, a diagnosis of HIV was inevitably going to become a case of AIDS and was almost categorically going to be a death sentence. And so in this period before 1996, AIDS accelerated temporal rhythms produced an urgency that led some activists to nurture documentation practices. David Roman, a scholar of performance and AIDS, credits this archival impulse to shifts in AIDS time, arguing that it emerged in the mid to late 1980s when it became clear that AIDS was not going anywhere anytime soon. This period correlates too with the emergence of ACT UP in New York in 1987. The kind of temporality we lived in that moment was a very intense kind of temporality, Deborah Levine told me, within which the dying was nearly categorical and there was no treatment. She went on to describe how activists did in the course of one day more than in normal life, where you didn't have the sense of mortality that you lived with among the people you lived with. A heightened sense of mortality characterized the distinctive temporal immediacy of activist archiving in the heat of emergency. Another activist, Alexis Danzig, described for me the temporal aspects of doing video documentation, in particular with the group Diva TV. She described how they were deliberately documenting what they were doing for the future, creating something for posterity and for the present at the same time, creating something for safety and being able to tell the story now. She described knowing that we were the news that we were making. Through documentation, activists asserted that our lives are in fact worth something, our lives are worth saving, our lives are worth documenting. And she concluded for me, we did save our own lives. And of course, these kinds of impulses to archive are complex and challenging, right? And as you'll see, I think, even in the kind of brief examples we've shared, ACT-UP becomes a kind of major figure here. And I want to talk, because it is a major focus of the book, very briefly about the kind of nostalgia and the relationship we have to this earlier period of AIDS activism. The profound, vital, nostalgic longing for ACT-UP is shaped by the group's archival representation, which reflects a desire to contest, disrupt, and refigure the political status quo. Nostalgia for ACT-UP, as practiced across generations, is produced in significant part by prevailing dissatisfaction with the intertwined politics of mainstream LGBTQ and AIDS movements and organizations. ACT-UP nostalgia centers around three idealized facets of the group's practice and its impacts: community unity, queer politics, and provocative aesthetics. Each of these facets is counter to the neoliberal assimilationist goals and practices that dominate LGBTQ politics and organizations, and the nonprofit industrial complex that constitutes a contemporary AIDS response. And what I hope to set up in my book, in part, is a kind of reclamation of nostalgia as a category. It's often kind of derided as a rosy-colored longing for good times, and in which, right, thinking about AIDS and thinking about the early AIDS crisis in particular might seem like a queer object for nostalgia. But in fact, right, what I argue for here is a kind of what I call a vital nostalgia, a nostalgia that thinks critically about the past in its kind of relationship to the past, which tells us, of course, much more about the present and the future. And I want to talk just very briefly about that kind of vital nostalgia. And so I really see vital nostalgia as this kind of productive practice for engaging with the AIDS past. And it's a kind of nostalgia that does a really different kind of work. It's a kind of nostalgia that pays particular attention to certain kinds of categories. So I'm going to read one last short piece here, thinking through vital nostalgia. Vital nostalgia, the analytic I develop in this book, names a process of questioning, contending with, and redressing power inequities that continually subject minoritized people to harm and violence, that is grounded in a critical activation of a yearning for a past time and the people who occupied it. This nostalgia is vital in multiple senses of the word. It is a vigorous, energetic force that is animate and changeable. It is fundamentally concerned with maintenance and the continuance of life and living beings. It pertains to the recording of pertinent data about human lives. vital nostalgia encompasses the complicated processes of interrogating our present through ongoing relationship to our past. This is a nostalgia that emphasizes the longing for the past while also attending to and illuminating its ambivalences, complexities, violences that continue to dictate life chances in the present. The temporal and affective drag of holding tightly onto the past in such a nostalgic practice is about its generative political potentiality for feeling, for imagining, and enacting a more just and livable now, a more vibrant future. And with that, I'll wrap up reading, and Joe and I have some questions for one another to put our work in conversation, and then we'll open the floor to hopefully have comments and questions from all of you as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think our work is so different, but it's hitting so many of the same notes. And when I first read your book, was obsessed with the way you frame this notion of vital nostalgia, and I want to start there because it's something that I've often found in myself when looking at previous activist moments of sort of longing, wishing for that type of movement to be a part of. And I think there's this tension in ACT UP as well, that people loved being in ACT UP. There was joy, there was humor, there was sex. But it was also, I was just reading a conversation with some of the folks who were in it about 1993 going to a Berlin conference, actually 21 years ago to this day, I believe. Is that right? 29 years ago to this day, and hearing that all the clinical trials had failed. And everyone basically, the comment was, we all went home and wrote our wills. And so there's this, why would you long for a period of time that was so full of grief? And I think vital nostalgia does that. We are so failed in our current moment to have any political organizing, any aspect of movement building. My question for you about vital nostalgia is, how do you see it as connected to actually movement building, activism work? Is vital nostalgia really vital if we're not using it as a platform for action?
Yeah, I don't think it is. And I think that's where I've gone back and forth, and I'm sure this happens to as a writer as well, and between like what, in returning to your work, like what feels the most powerful or the most compelling in a particular moment. And I think I often return to the work of Visual AIDS here, which is a community-based arts organization based in New York City. And the third chapter of the book looks particularly at the founding and development of their archive project, which is open to anyone who identifies first as an artist, whether or not they make their living as an artist, and as someone who identifies as having HIV or AIDS, and to the estates of artists who have passed. And I think their project for me exemplifies kind of what doing a vital nostalgia might look like in a kind of archival frame. It's an archive that very much is at the center of the organization's work. And they use very routinely, it includes artists who are quite well known and acclaimed, Robert Mapplethorpe, David Wojnarowicz, and others, Keith Haring, and they often use the work of well-known artists, artists who are kind of part of this art aids canon, as a way to draw in audiences and to engage them with the work of contemporary artists, and particularly contemporary artists who are part of groups who are predominantly most affected by at least the crisis in the US, right? Trans people, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people. And I think they have some really powerful examples of how they use that work that is so iconic to draw in audiences, to kind of use that nostalgia to connect to contemporary AIDS activism and AIDS art activism, but also to think about it in relation to other things that are happening in the present moment. And I think it's a really beautiful example of how to use some of these kinds of objects that are the center point of nostalgia for this time period to recenter the present.
One of the things I love so much about the archives is how messy they are. And like, I'm not an archivist myself. I've done some, but not much archival research. But if you talk to anyone who's done a lot and ask them for like, doctors always have the stories of like what they pull it out of butts. Like, oh, we have a box in the ER for everything we pulled out of butts. And archivists have stories of like the crazy shit. An archivist friend told me this week, if you're ever looking at someone's hard drive and there's a folder labeled pornography, look in that folder. Like, you will find some gems there. You will find some weird things.
When you start asking people for things, I got very interested in like actual bodily traces in archives. And once you start asking, everybody has hair or ashes or something in their collection. And I think one of the weirdest research and most amazing research experiences of my life was going to Yale to look at Samuel Stewart's papers. And Samuel Stewart was first an English professor, but then a pornographer, and had a relationship with Alfred Kinsey in which he documented his sexual life. And his collection contains records of all of the people who he had intimate relations with, and included in that is pubic hair. And so you're sitting in a Yale reading room with like samples of pubic hair on these cards next to people who are doing like, research on medieval manuscripts and things. It's a very funny place to do that kind of work.
Oh my goodness. Homosexuals are too much. Sometimes it's like they gave us too much, take our rights away. I mean, I can't joke about this at the moment because they are trying to take our rights away. The question I wanted to ask about the messiness of archives is I like how your book deals with conflict between generations of activists at the time. I mean, the visual aids thing, you have this whole like Facebook thread that is like full of vitriol. And I wonder how you think about curating that type of conflict and how it can show us, the messiness of archives, the conflict you see there that in so many narratives gets glossed over or washed away. That what can those conflicts actually show us that can be illustrative to our work in our times?
Yeah, I think there's also something interesting, right, about the kind of interplay between conversations in physical space and conversations in digital space, and like whether they have the same kind of tenor and tone, right, even amongst the same people. And the moment Joe mentions is in relation to a poster called Your Nostalgia is Killing Me, which was created by two Canadian activist artists, Vincent Chevalier and Ian Bradley Perrin, for Poster Virus, which is a project from Toronto's AIDS Action Now. And that poster, of course, talks about nostalgia, and that actually became the center point of the kind of controversy, is whether people could actually have nostalgia for this kind of period of AIDS activism. And some activists, primarily of kind of generations who had been active in groups like ACT UP in the late 80s and early 90s, talked significantly about how they didn't think nostalgia could be, like, it wasn't possible to have nostalgia for this moment, and that was dismissive of their memories and the lived experience and the work that they did. And there was like lots of acrimony in these kind of Facebook debates. And I think there are interesting moments. You and I were talking earlier about kind of the ACT UP Oral History Project as a really like interesting example of kind of conflict on the record, right? Sarah Shulman's a very unusual and interesting narrator who has a particular kind of narrative about ACT UP and about AIDS activism in that period. And she actively argues with some of the people who she's interviewing for the Oral History Project who were also active in the same group in the same period. And I think that's one of those rare, beautiful moments where you actually get to like see the kind of conflict and the stakes of this work still. And I think Jason Bauman, who is the curator for LGBT and AIDS collections at the New York Public Library, really powerfully described it for me as like, this was this really like central and powerful experience, and like a thing where people gave up their lives and were doing this full time, and where it has this kind of ongoing, I think, trauma is a messy word to use, but like there is this kind of collective trauma attached. And like, I think it's in those moments in bringing people in conversation with these records that you really get to kind of see that conflict play out. And I do think nostalgia from people who were in those rooms is different from the kind of nostalgia I have as somebody who was a child in the early 90s and not in those rooms, right? And I think the stakes of that work can be real for each of us, but they're different. And I think your work too points to that, like kind of distinction in experience, right? That is so generational, but where there is so much kind of space needed for conversation and for maybe even conflict right across generations.
Conflict can be so generative. It can be so clarifying.
As Sarah Schulman herself, right, would write in conflict.
Indeed. And you know, and then there was so much conflict around her book around ACT UP of both people. I mean, there was the notion that because the oral history was done in the aughts, that the people who lived were the people with the most power in the group. And yes, there was a lot of people who were lost. This is not like an easy, like Death Never is like an easy sort of, if you have A identity, then you have Y outcome. But certainly, you know, any archive is going to have, you know, you talk so much in your book about an archive as being sort of, in the time of AIDS, there was so much death, there was such urgency to archive because it felt like a way to almost counter the death. And, you know, the stakes are still so high. I mean, when you talk about stakes, it's like everyone has stakes for HIV. I mean, people are still getting it and people are still dying of it. We still have new cases in our queer community every year. And so I think I'm super curious about, you know, how we have healthy conflict between people where everyone has such high stakes.
Yeah, and I think it's right. Sometimes it's a recognition across those spaces that everyone does have high stakes in these conversations, right? And different stakes in these conversations. And I think part of my task in writing this into a book, though it obviously far less so than you are present in your own text, was making myself kind of present in the text, because my generational positionality, the whiteness, my gender, my queerness, right, figure fundamentally. And I think I feel like I also got to live some of those kind of intergenerational conversations, right, as it's a real like privilege. And I think my favorite part of doing research, right, to like sit down and talk to people about experiences and stories and narratives that are deeply meaningful to them. But I think they also had questions for me. And it was like one of those spaces where not generally have conflict, but like where you actually do get to have that kind of dialogue. And I think we should have much more space for doing that.
Talking about stakes and the various difficult moments that we're facing. I mean, we're facing so many crises. It's a time of accelerating like capitalism and climate change and all of the things that come along with that. In your community, do you feel like there are any communities or activist groups that are still really missing from archival records? And are there any interventions that one can make? You know, I sort of talked to my friend Stephen about if you don't have access to archive your life and then you die, it's like a double death. There's no possibility of like capturing that again. So I'm wondering about who is still silent in terms of the archival world.
Yeah, I mean, well, many people, but I think right, we can think about the kinds of access to power and privilege that shaped, right, people's understandings of their stories having meaning and worth, and why this period of AIDS activism is so well documented. I don't think that contemporary AIDS activism is going to be as well documented. I don't think contemporary AIDS experiences in the US are going to be documented, and that's very much about, right, who is predominantly living with HIV now, and their positioning, right, their racial positioning, their gender positioning, their socioeconomic positioning, right, along with other, exactly, right, is that we're not going to have the same kind of documentation, and we culturally think generally about AIDS as something we've dealt with, at least in an American context, and as a problem of, right, like the rest of the world, rather than a problem kind of within the US, I think, in dominant culture. And so that definitely will also shape, I think, who's thinking about documenting what. I do think there are also, of course, there are challenges to documenting also, like digital work and activism, that will mean both the things we're doing now are more well documented in certain respects and far less well documented in others, and the ways in which we use private platforms to do so much of our work, right, will also shape. And just the challenges of preserving, we're much better in the archival position at preserving paper. We've been doing it for a long time than we are at preserving digital records, right, which is really an ongoing process and an ongoing, like, challenge and series of, like, it's really like a continuous process, right, rather than something that's been completed. And I want to make sure I get to ask you some questions as well. Can you talk about the kind of role of HIV/AIDS in your book? Because this is a book, right, that's more broadly about viruses and about COVID, amongst others. But I think I see HIV as playing kind of a central role throughout the book. And I wondered if you could talk about why and how kind of AIDS figures into the book.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's essential to who I am as a person. I was born in 1983, and it was in 1983/1984 that the virus was identified to be the cause of GRID, as it was called then, which we now understand to be HIV. I've never, well, prior to 2012, I'd never had a single sexual encounter that where an HIV wasn't present. It just didn't exist for me, and met for many people in my community. It is a part of who we are. And so I argue in the book that HIV may not materially infect us all, but we all live with it. And this became essential understanding when COVID-19 started arriving and people were resistant to changing their lives in material ways to reduce harm to themselves and others, as though it was some sort of massive sacrifice, without understanding that for many of us who grew up never knowing sex before HIV, as Matilda, who's in the room, talks about, we have been doing this our whole life. I mean, literally our whole lives. And it's not that it's not difficult. It's not that it's pleasant to do. It's not that PrEP, for example, hasn't helped me recover some sense of sexual or physical intimacy without the fear of HIV. But it is worth doing hard things to not materially harm people or yourself. And so everything I view through the framework of HIV just is a part of who I am, and is a part of why viruses fascinated me as I started learning about molecular biology. HIV has 9 genes, and you have 20,000 or more. And yet HIV can be deadly to your organism. Your 43 trillion cells, 20,000 genes, and 3.2 billion letters of DNA can be killed by something as small as a virus. And that is both aesthetically beautiful and horrifying. Viruses are incredible molecular tricksters, and they're fascinating and horrifying. And so those places where biology is insufficient to tell the full story, I think are places I gravitate to. And sex and sexuality through my life has always been that place. Biology is not enough because I've lived my whole life the experiences that I have.
And building on that too, I think one of the things I love about your book is how accessible you make the kind of complexity of some of the science that happens, and the way you always think about that kind of science as deeply embedded in politics and culture and all of those kind of co-producing one another. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more, in particular, when you're thinking about the kinds of ways that viruses are more than biological forces, about who and how we can survive and maybe even thrive in this kind of environment of viruses, whether HIV or COVID or many others. And I think one of the ways you pose, kind of drawing on queer theory and queer culture and queer community, is kind of notions of care and particular queer notions of care. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about care in relation to your work.
I'm going to start in a place that you might not see where I'm going, but I hope you will by the end. I'm going to tell two stories. I studied biology and post-colonial French literature as an undergraduate, so that my brain is always sort of, in 1960, the Congo is liberated from Belgium. In 1960, in the Congo, there are 0 doctors, 0 engineers, 0 college professors. Sometime 20 years prior, a virus, HIV, began transmitting between humans in the Congo in the context of the colonial system. The transmission of this virus to humans maps exactly on the way the colony moved resources and people around. In 1960, because there are no doctors or engineers or college professors, many people come from Haiti, a Francophone country, to do the work of country building. And then the Haitian immigrants bring HIV to Haiti, where it arrives in 1969 in New York. The violence of colonialism is the initiating point of the HIV pandemic. It arrives to New York through the violence of the colonial legacy. Story number 2. We stopped vaccinating against smallpox in West and Central Africa in 1980. The smallpox vaccine also protects against an endemic virus there called monkeypox. The population over the following 3 decades becomes less and less immunized against smallpox and therefore against monkeypox. Monkeypox cases grow in the largely young, largely not immune population, to the point where 2018, we see sustained human-to-human spread of monkeypox in urban centers in Nigeria. And this year, we see sustained 1,000+ cases around the world. We could have been immunizing folks in the endemic region against this virus if we gave a shit about them. And we don't. Infectious diseases show us how interconnected we all are and how capitalism renders us all vulnerable. And it is a choice, from the level of how you care about your sex partners and your friends to the level of who we immunize around the world. We do immeasurable harm when we view ourselves as separate and view our health as separate from anybody else. So it is literally from cooking dinner with a friend to yelling at the Biden administration. They let 28 million doses of the safe new monkeypox and smallpox vaccine expire in the stockpile, in the US stockpile. There was not, we have all these doses, we don't need them. This was several years ago. Let's send them to an endemic region where they could be used to stop a current outbreak. No, they expired. There is a lack of care built into capitalism at every level. And our whole lives are going to be extinguished unless we stop it. And when I think about the urgency of ACT UP, I cannot imagine not feeling that way right now.
It's true, like beautiful and powerful way. I think before I turn it over to our audience, I think my other question for you was going to be about kind of what can we take from virology for all the kind of like things that are unfolding as we speak, monkeypox, all of the other viruses we're living with and alongside. Can you talk a bit about kind of what you hope we take as these kinds of viruses continue to unfold, and perhaps kind of what's happened after you've turned in this manuscript?
I'm really angry. I'm so like angry and emotional at the moment. The big point of the book is the problem is not viruses. Viruses are the most abundant life form on Earth. There are more viruses on Earth than there are stars in the sky. If we think about the virus as our enemy, we will only continue to harm ourselves. Our enemies are all of the systems built to separate and atomize and disconnect us from one another, and to have us not have good biomedicine available to everyone on planet Earth. When you stars are way less hot than phage. When you go swimming in the ocean, you know, every ounce of ocean water has billions of phage in it, billions of viruses. And so I am excited to live on a viral planet because it's the only planet we have. And then when we see viruses that do us harm, the vast exceptions to the rule, remember that the harm is not the virus. The harm is the lack of access to care.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. And that's one of the things I loved about your book, is that I think as someone who studies a pandemic and thinks about a virus that does great harm, I spend very little time thinking about all of the viruses that don't do us great harm, and even the viruses, right, that allow our system to learn things and to have a like immune response. And that I loved thinking about viruses as a different, it kind of reclaims viruses almost, right, as like thinking about them as a more complex force than something that just does great harm, right?
A virologist friend came to my book launch, and when I talked to her about some of my favorite work by a scientist who's literally named Skip Virgin III, and I was just like, you know, I was like, herpes is a part of our immune system. And she was like, herpes is a part of our immune system. It's just these viruses have been around before us. We all have them. Pretty much everyone has a herpes virus inside you right now. That herpes dies when you die. That's it. You are the herpes is you. And so it is essential, I think, to reclaim the virus from the violence done to it by capitalism mostly.
And maybe that's a good moment to open it to questions. And I think I've seen a few things come up in the chat, and I think Karen's going to hop back in and make sure we make it to everything.
Hi, Karen.
Wow. This is an amazing conversation. So we're going to start with Ngofing, who asks, is there anything we can learn from survivors of violent conflict, wars, and genocides when it comes to nostalgia for death-filled times? As we think about nostalgia around ACT UP, I wonder if we've seen similar experiences in survivors of, say, the former Yugoslav conflicts, etc.
That's a really interesting question, I think, right? And for better, in ways that are both kind of generative and deeply problematic, right? AIDS is often talked about as a kind of genocide, and particularly as a kind of Holocaust is used as a frequent kind of metaphor, or even, right, James Wensley has a film that uses, right, Holocaust imagery in it to talk about AIDS. And so, right, like there is this like linking with other kinds of death. And again, I think there are interesting and productive examples in the AIDS sphere of this, right, in some of those same ways that resonate with what Joe was just talking about in terms of colonialism, right? One of the artists I'm lucky enough to write about, Demian Dimiyazi's work, talks about AIDS as part of a kind of larger genocidal settler colonialism enacted, right? He's got a piece that talks about like 1492 as, right, like the origin of AIDS as much as the origin of other kinds of violence against Indigenous peoples in North America, right? And so I think there are like moments where putting all of these things in conversation is productive and generative, and yet, right, like when we compare things, there's also, right, like slippages and erasures and omissions that we get. And so I think, and I wonder what Joe's answer to this is, I think there's some productivity in terms of thinking about the people who die as a result of viruses in comparison to other kinds of violence and harm, and the ways those are also play out along these kind of structural aspects to power. And I think, right, I think there are moments where that is productive, and there are moments where that just creates kind of slippages and omissions and the kind of particularities of harm and the way structures of violence operate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with everything you said. I mean, when things get flattened and it's like, this is just like that, that both crises lose their urgency, their humanness, really their humanness. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I love about archives is they capture humanness, the messiness of being human. So I think one answer to this question that I have is I would love to see archival research done in the face of each of these types of human crisis. I live in the world of literature. And so as I was, I have an essay about my private writings, my journals from the New York City lockdown, which was just, and those of us who are trying to prevent the type of mass death that happened from happening, and then it happened anyway, and then we were all sitting in our homes, unable to do laundry, almost unable to eat, and there's sirens going off, and there's mass graves, and there's refrigerated trucks full of bodies, and we're not seeing anybody. And it was a type of hell unlike any other that I've known in my life. And I recognized, as I was reading 20th century French literature about the Holocaust, some other literature about public crises and wars and genocide, that there kept being this image that I kept seeing, and that I kept seeing in my own writing, which was being surprised or frightened by a patch of blue sky or something normal or beautiful. Mm. And that image and that the tension between normalcy and crisis, I would go on a walk, and the city would feel surreal, but I would also just be walking my normal walk to work somehow. And so I definitely saw images and ties and connections, and almost in a way that I didn't feel was flattening. I felt we were having a sort of shared collective catharsis of grief, of the full humanness of what it is to suffer through a moment of such mass loss, which I just think is different than other human experiences of grief and loss. So I think looking to the specifics of literature and archives are a great way to ask questions like, is there an inherent human response to sort of a mass death event?
Right. And we have a question from Chanda that I think is maybe a little related to this. And they're wondering if Joe could say more about living at the intersection of fascination with viruses and maybe even a kind of respect for them and a lived fear of them.
It is so hard. I mean, I literally did undergrad work on viruses that were a model system from HIV. I'm too sloppy a scientist to work on actual HIV. I would give myself actual HIV in 2 seconds. You don't want me in a BSL-3 lab. I'd be like drinking my coffee and my sage. It would be a mess. I don't know what to say about it, I guess, other than I'm going to answer the question in a weird way, which is that if it weren't for the biology of HIV and its complexity, we would know much less about the cell. We learned about how our bodies and our cells function by studying how HIV perturbs them. And we've learned it, we all know more than we ever wanted to about viral evolution. There is no inevitable turn that a virus will take toward being mild, being sort of an endosymbiont. And yet there are viruses very closely related to HIV, 8% or so of all of our genomes, that use the same molecular trickery, the same genius of around 9 genes to replicate themselves, but in a way that is not only wholly benign, but that, like herpes, has become potentially, this is still being studied, a part of our early development. So without those endogenous retroviruses, we would not be human. And I think there's something endlessly curious about that. Studying HIV did not make me less afraid of it. Good access to care did. PrEP made me less afraid of HIV. Undetectable equals untransmittable made me less afraid of HIV. So I view science as the research of science can build medicines. Access to those medicines can transform lived experience. But that's not necessarily inherently the same thing as the curiosity of asking a basic scientific question, like how 9 genes can do what they need to do. I don't even know if I answered that question at all. It's really hard. I think those 2 parts of my brain are like this, completely orthogonal, of being fascinated by HIV and being terrified of it.
Well, I think that that your book is brilliant and groundbreaking and virology. And I encourage everyone to read this book. And I think that you approach both viruses and people with love. And also, Marika, you too are approaching viruses, community activism with love too. And I think maybe that's the most brilliant thing about what both of you are doing. It's we're having kind of a love message this season from different kinds of quarters, but I feel it really strongly in both of your research programs and also in your work. And I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. And hope I get to see you in person one of these days. But until then, I appreciate your words. They both Marika and Joseph have great Twitter accounts. Please follow them. They're a little earlier in the chat, or you can just look them up. And thanks so much for joining us. And read these books. We've got them at Elliott Bay. So take care and good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.